Thank you for joining us. We're here with Dr. Kerry Wood. Dr. Kerry Wood is the author of The Gifts of the Spirit for a New Generation. And in this session, we want to talk a little bit about the book in general. So, Dr. Kerry, thank you for being with us.
My joy.
Tell us a little bit about the book. Let's start with, why did you write the book?
Well, first of all, I want to say it's a great privilege and a pleasure to be able to talk to you and to be able to share my heart with you about why we wrote the book. And I'm so thrilled that you're jumping into the book, because I believe it's a cry of the heart of the Father for His church and for the planet. So why did I write the book? Several reasons. One, I grew up in a Pentecostal background where the things of the gifts of the Spirit were very important to us. They were a priority, but I also saw the church moving further and further away, even in Pentecostal circles. They would distance themselves from things that might look sketchy. And so I thought, well, if this is a gift from God, then it shouldn't be something we should be embarrassed about. So number one, I really saw where the church needed to re-embrace the gifts that the Father had given us through the Son by the Holy Spirit. And so I've always had this passion in my heart to see the church living in the fullness of everything God has provided. Secondly, it was really coming to an understanding that the Father's heart is not about just sheer power or overcoming the power of the devil. It was out of a heart of love and compassion, and we get into that in chapter 1, which was very different even from the way I was raised. I was raised that you use the gifts of the Spirit to get you a ministry, to get you power, to get a name for yourself, or to cast out devils, and all of those things are a part of it, of course. But when I begin to see the Father's heart, when I begin to see that He's a God of love, overflowing mercy and compassion, I begin to realize, all of these gifts are about healing the broken. They're really not about the person who's giving the gift. It's about the person who's receiving the gifts. And so that's why we put as chapter number 1, the compassion that is behind the gifts. And I think you'll find that very important. And then thirdly, as I begin to teach in universities and Christian universities, I begin to realize that many of our Christian students, even in Christian Pentecostal universities, didn't know anything about the Holy Spirit, didn't have a desire really for the Holy Spirit. And so I would even give them surveys. What do you think about the Holy Spirit? What do you think about the gifts? Do we need the gifts? And many of the students would say, if the church is doing okay without it, then, do we really need it? And it seems to cause so much controversy. So I begin to have this passion in my heart to communicate a balanced view of the gifts of the Spirit as they come from a loving Father, not just to give people ministry, but to heal the broken and to release His love and His compassion to people.
So you talked a little bit about some parts of the church shying away from the gifts of the Spirit because they seem spooky or something. So what was your experience with the gifts of the Spirit up to this point that brought you to writing this book?
Well, like I've said, I had a broad experience growing up from my earliest days in childhood and seeing both incredible miracles and seeing some abuses in the things of the gifts of the Spirit. So in my own experience, I had a desire to see the real thing. Even as a teenager, I remember my passion was, God, restore the real thing to the church. Don't let us be afraid of it, and don't let us misrepresent who you really are in your heart and your passion to people. So the driving force then, when I began to lead pastors and lead church, then it was for me to try to model something to people that was loving, compassionate, not abusive, not setting one person up over another, not creating celebrities that everybody runs after, but to let the whole world see through the church, number one, that all of us can flow in the gifts of the Spirit. It's not just for an elite few that have the gifts and wear it as a badge, but all of us can flow in the gifts of the Spirit, and it becomes the supernatural endowment for every one of us to do what Jesus called us to do.
So in this book, you cover a breadth of topics. You're not talking just about basically a description of the gifts or just how to move in the gifts, but you're going to cover more of a foundation for why the gifts and stuff. So can you tell us a little bit about how the book is laid out?
Yeah, so if you've got the book, then you might want to just look at it with me, and you could see that what we start with is a foundation of compassion. That first of all, we can't really understand the gifts of God unless we understand His nature. And so as I begin to study the nature of God as a triune being, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, that He's first and foremost relational. He is first and foremost relational. That's why we could say, and John can say, God is love. He's first and foremost relational. So I begin to realize, whoa, if God is first and foremost relational, then the gifts that He gives are also going to be relational. Part of the purpose of the way He gives it through us, instead of just dropping it out of heaven, is so that we have to relate to one another. We have to touch and minister and communicate and share and give our lives to one another. So this is a key. We start with the foundation of the nature of God, and that being love. What do the gifts look like if the primary motivation and flow of the gift is compassion? That's section 1. Section 2 is where we really just get to know the manifestation gifts of the Spirit. The manifestation gifts of the Spirit are found in 1 Corinthians chapter 12. And so in those manifestations of the Spirit, they're neatly broken down. It's interesting that Father, Son, Holy Spirit, God is a 3-in-1 God, and then His gifts can neatly be broken down into power gifts, utterance gifts, revelation gifts, and there's 3 manifestations in each one of those 3. So we just look at each one of the manifestations of the Spirit, and then we really go after in section 3, how do we understand the hindrances, the things that want to keep us from flowing in the love of God like that, and then how do we cultivate the gifts so that you and I can learn how to partner with the Holy Spirit so that we can anticipate every day being used by the Father through the gifts of the Spirit. We finish up with some pastoral insights and some understanding of how this can impact our church, how it can impact ministry. But that's basically how we approach it.
That's great. So obviously the layout might be a little bit different from other books. Is there something else from your heart that you would say, what makes this book different from other books about the gifts of the Spirit?
A couple of things. One, I would say first and foremost, it is looking at the gifts of the Spirit as the overflow of God's compassion, as we've said. I've not found any books on the gifts of the Spirit that really approach it this way. Usually it's approaching it as how I can have power, how I can cast out devils, how I can do supernatural things. But if we miss the motivation, then we're always going to end up a mile off of the target. We're going to end up drawing attention to ourselves, getting people to follow us, create codependent followers. And we don't have to do that when we can just get full of Him and give Him away in love. The second thing I would say is that we really teach the gifts of the Godhead in this book. I don't know that you'll see that in too many other places, but the Father's gifts are His creation gifts. They're wired in us at the beginning. We don't deal with these specifically, but to simply say there's a difference. The Father's gifts are seen in Romans chapter 12, how we're really hardwired from birth to fulfill our purpose. Then the Son's gifts are found in Ephesians chapter 4. Because He's the head of the church, He gives gifts to the church to grow the church to fulfill her purpose. But then the Spirit's gifts, and that's what we're talking about in the gifts of the Spirit. The Spirit's gifts are manifestations which actually empower us supernaturally to do what we can't do in and of ourselves. And the one other thing I think to answer your question that would be unique is we would say that all the gifts of the Spirit are supernatural in nature. In other words, the word of knowledge is not a desire to go to college. The word of knowledge is a supernatural download of God's, a piece, an event, something that He knows that we don't know, that we need to know.
Wow, it's going to be really interesting to get into all of that. So for people who are getting started with this book, what would you recommend as the best format for them to go through the book and get the most out of it?
Well, it's a great question because how you approach something is going to really determine what you come away with. And many of you may be taking the book in a university format and an education format. You're going to be studying the book and there'll be some dialogue in class, we would hope. But ideally, study the book in relationship with others, in a small group, or I would prefer triads. In a group of 3, you get the perfect input from two other people, and you read something, you see that, you hear, wow, that's good. But then when you share it, somebody else sees something totally different, and it expands even more. Any way you can study in relationship, you're going to grow faster.
Well, thank you. Thank you, Dr. Kerry, and thank you for joining us. And we look forward to getting more into each of the chapters of the book so we can get the most out of that.